What's up guys, the Strongboys19 here. This is going to be another album review for a new 2021 release. And I'm going to be reviewing the latest album from the band Dream Theater, entitled A View from the Top of the World. So A View from the Top of the World is the band's 15th studio album in their discography, follow-up to Distance Over Time. This was released through the record label of Inside Out, with the involvement of Andy Sneap. Now, with the majority onto the album, a lot of the changes in Dream Theater's sound after Mike Portnoy's departure can be very indifferent for a lot of people. But for me, as I have been a fan of Dream Theater for quite a while now, I do respect the directions that the band decided to make, and I cannot absolutely forget these guys as personally one of my favourite progressive metal bands, as the album that made me fall in love with this band was the 90s album of Images and Words, to releasing other albums that are one of my favourites, including Awake, 6 Degrees of Inner Turbulence, and also the infamous concept album of Metropolis Part 2, to some albums that I think that were very underrated, that I did like quite a bit, like Falling Into Infinity, and I actually did a review on their self-titled album, which to this day some people give that one a bit of a mixed response, but I actually really did like that album for what it is. However, this is the latest album to credit Mike Mangini on the drums since he joined the band in 2010 after Portnoy's departure. Now, this album has been absolutely anticipated for many, and involving myself, I was pretty optimistic to dive into Dream Theater's music, because I think that a lot of the albums, especially with the 2000s, have been very much consistent, like with 6 Degrees, but also with albums like Octavarium and Train of Thought. Well, I have to say that this current direction for Dream Theater, I can see why some people give the band a bit of a critical response. But to me, Dream Theater is still Dream Theater, and with this album now fully released, I think that this album does have a lot of the optimism that the band wanted to make, and I really appreciate this direction for the band for that. This is another very long album. It is 70 minutes in its entirety for 7 tracks. The first track and the single of the album that has been released as a music video prior to this album's release of The Alien. A big start on the complexity involving these guitar minor riffs and blistering drums takes me with a systematic chaos type of setting as the music moves. The verse sections then decide to take things in a softer touch with a bit of melody on the guitar lines and slowing the adrenaline down, and the music personally dives in with a direction of mixing the instrumentation with mood and a dramatic set of performances. And I have to say that the additional drama makes it a bit more diverse, and it follows each piece pretty consistently, and as well with the vocals that were at a smooth tone on the harmonies and with Labree's mid-range. I think it is a very strong match on the solos, and a lot of the virtuoso playing an action does stand out, and as well as a lot of that is really consistent on the record. So I think that The Alien, I thought, was a very, very good opening track, although it does take me on a bit of like a similarity on some riffs from the Systematic Chaos record. The next track on the album is Answering the Call, hearing synthesizer noises and a riff that is like, to me, on a bit of like a new metal edge, and it's like making a mixture on something like on a Train of Thought type of heaviness, and some of the keyboard sounds over time do remind me on a bit of a Yes kind of mark of the music. The simplicity of the grudge sounding guitar chords were hitting while the vocals were building some more strength. I'll have to say that Mike's drumming on this song really works with the chops and versatility. The structure was on a pretty decent mode onto the melody and with its driving performances. I think by switching the sound of the main big sound of the band and then transitioning back into the calmer, mellow parts were a very good part of the track, as it expands some more onto the skills of the interaction for the guitars and the synthesizers. Pretty dynamic number, but it's something onto not much of an adventurous type of setting as the Alien was. The second single on the album, Invisible Monster, a sweet clean mix onto the opening, and as the band comes in with their matching themselves together type of direction. But I think that it's a pretty consistent number onto the piano sound, and I think that it was a smooth touch where they just take things into a bit of a softer edge. The mood is where I think vocally was pretty strong and was building a sound of some dramatic melody across the board. Sleeping Giant, this is a bit of a difference in tone as the music was changing into something more of a minor, darker type of roots from the riffs, and the keyboards were making some tension with the introduction, and with Mangini delivering the chops as well onto his frenetic skill. I think that the main interplay between the musicianship was very good, making things so tight along the lines. Change of music into the verse sections was very, very good, and for me the best part about the instrumentation. But as the chorus just goes in, unfortunately it does distract what I really liked from the earlier and the later parts of the track, because I like that type of impending and ominous type of setting. It's a very consistently prominent number involving the keyboards, that it does have a bit of an ambience feel to it, despite the other pieces that I've liked were taken away from the sound of the chorus to me. So I think that Sleeping Giant is a variety grown track that I did like for what it is, but at the same time it's not one of like the best numbers on the record. Transcending Time, this is an opening that makes me think and wonder about of like a bright poppy sound of like an images and words type. I really like this track. It's the only major part of the band with their vibes here, because I think that there are some rhythmic playing styles involving some transitions from being major into the minor, which I think was absolutely brilliant. James LaBrie's vocals were brilliant on this track, involving these harmonies here and there. It's very, very precise on the produced sound, and the shredding from John Petrucci was just absolutely controlled and ballistic. I think that this is one of the best numbers on the album because it involves such an admirable adrenaline type of feeling. And I think this has been one of the other really strong numbers of this record. To the weaker track, in my opinion, the weakest number on the record being Awaken the Master. Then you hear some monstrously low, heavy sound on the guitars from John Petrucci as he was bringing in some grunty, gent-ish type of style, and the drums and keyboards were syncopating all over. It's so presentable of hearing the band in full action and driving the sound with a mostly instrumental part of the music. As the vocals from LaBrie do come in, I think that it has a pretty decent mark of ability, though there are some moments of this album's track that does remind me of like a 6 Degrees, but not as a well-balanced or a perfectionism type. This is a song that I think does not really deliver all that strongly because it doesn't have like a memorable hook at the same time. So as I think Awaken the Master is mainly the only subpar track on the record, there's a lot to really like involving the technicality and the complexity that the rest of the band do deliver. And then the last track and the final number on the record, the 20-minute epic of A View from the Top of the World. Slow, marching introduction in a bit of like a cinematic setting, hearing occasional noises of some harps, heavy chord hittings and strings, as well as the keyboards. The drums from Mangini were very much aggressive on this number, and the bass from John Mayung sounded absolutely big on this track, as he's one of my favourite metal bassists. Mangini stole the show involving a track like this because he's just such an admirable, controlled and playful drummer for Dream Theater. And there were a lot of interactions on the verse sections at the same time as that dark, ominous type of tonality with some atmosphere that was continuing the dominating work of the band here. So much going on to this track that it goes in various sections that I thought some of the riffs were really good, and changing the tonality onto at first being aggressive and then making it really much more calmer and spacious. Vocally sounded decent as the piano follows along with the bass lines. And there were other pieces of the instrumentation where I think it was progressing very solidly, especially on with the production. Though I think that as an epic, it doesn't really fulfill myself as calling it one of the masterpiece long tracks, not like with the previous album tracks of epics like Octavarium to 6 Degrees, etc. Moments on the album where I think some of the songwriting was a little bit weak and not really marking themselves as really catchy or as a bigger presence of dynamics. And I think that sometimes Labríe's vocals on the album safe, and for a vocal point of view for Dream Theater, I don't think this is like one of his best albums, though I give him so much credit, as I do love Labríe's vocals quite a lot for Dream Theater's music, involving vocals from albums like Images and Words, Awake, and Metropolis Part 2, etc. Also, I think that the production sounded mostly very good, from the distorting guitars and the drums, and as well as the flashing keyboards. But the gripe that I have with it, I wish that John Mayung's bass tone should have been really consistent, because they sounded really backed off from the mixing, and that is a bit of a disappointing part for the album, as that I think, as well as Petrucci and Labrie, and when Portnoy was still in the band, they were making Dream Theater bigger, but I think that Mayung was a very important part for the band's sound, and as well as the different keyboardists that the band had worked with throughout the band's career. So I think that the production could have been done a little bit better with a better mix. The album as a whole, I think A View from the Top of the World by Dream Theater is a very, very solid album, but as a fan myself, this is really not one of the band's best albums. There are some points of the record where I can accept some bit of the replayable value on tracks that I did like, but for earlier albums, this is really not one of their strongest, though I do appreciate what type of direction the band wanted to make into this case of making an album to follow up Distance Over Time. And that's all I have to say about the new Dream Theater album. And if you have any words and comments to talk about this album, please address them in the comments below and let me know, because I would like to be involved with anyone who's a fan of the band and wants to dive into this type of album with whatever opinion that you really have for the record. I'm going to give this album a rating that I was really torn about. I was either going to give this album an 8 out of 10, but the more I thought about it further and further along the lines, yet alone there's a lot to like on the record, there were weaknesses that kind of derail the adrenaline and the connection that I wanted to make with this album. I think I'm going to give this album a 7.5 out of 10. So that's personally, I think, a very acceptable rating. Let me know what you really think about the album, and I am really curious. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll keep you guys posted for more videos in the near future.